Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today is the finale of the new combos and synergies from Aetherdrift. We got the full set, so we've got some pretty sweet cards to talk about, a few rares, and some pretty good uncommons as well, and commons. Let's jump right into it with the Coalstoke Gearhulk, which is 5 mana, red and black construct. So this is completes our Gearhulk cycle here. It's a 5/4 with Menace and Death Touch, and it says when it enters, put target creature card with mana value 4 or less from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains Menace, Death Touch, and Haste, and at the beginning of your next end step, you exile the creature. So note it gives a finality counter, and you exile it, so you can't really do any like looping stuff with this necessarily. But there's certainly some combos that you can pull off with this guy, especially with shapeshifters, clone effects, and we actually just got a new clone effect in this set too, the Wax Shape Stealer, which works really well with this. It comes into play if you have this in your graveyard, which you can pretty easily get it in there because it has cycling. You can bring that back and create another copy of it, which will have haste essentially. If you have, say, 4 clones in your graveyard, you could get 20 damage in play. Now that's kind of a big ask, perhaps. So I don't know how viable that combo is actually going to be. Seems like it could be okay. It's definitely got potential if you can fill up your graveyard with clones. This thing can be quite powerful. Outside of that kind of combo, I think this card's okay. I mean, it's not a terrible stat line, and Menace and Death Touch can be useful. You can also steal things from your opponent's graveyard. So if you have made them discard something or destroyed one of their creatures, you can get that back. Um, but I think you want to, if you're playing this card, you probably want to build around it in your own deck in the sense that you want to have some 3 drops or 4 drops that are pretty good to get back. I'm trying to think of what else could be useful. Goblin Chain Whirler came to mind for Pioneer. I think that would be really good because it gives it Death Touch, and Goblin Chain Whirler does 1 damage to everything, to all your opponent's creatures. So this would completely destroy your opponent's entire board of creatures, and you can get in for 3 damage with the Chain Whirler as well. Kind of interesting with Kona, maybe, because Kona often dies. You play it out, it dies right away. If there's some sort of Jund deck and then you played this, got the Kona back, attacked with Menace, then it would trigger in the second main phase. So, and then you could put any permanent from your hand into play. Kind of interesting. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this Gearhulk. If there's any other good sort of 4 drops, 3 drops, or cards that you think would work particularly well with it. I'll probably try out this interesting combo with all these different clone effects, and you can get more. I think in standard there's only 2 clones currently legal, but obviously if you go down back to Pioneer or other formats, there's a ton of different clone creatures that you could kind of get back with this. So maybe it's more of a combo suited for older formats. Not sure. We'll test it out and see how it goes. So overall, I think Coalstoke Gearhulk is pretty powerful. It's got some combo potential. It can do some pretty powerful things, especially with Chain Whirler. I feel like could be useful, and could be played just for value as well. Overall, I think I'm going to give it 7.5 loots out of 10. Okay, next up we've got the Howlsquad Heavy, which is 3 mana for a Goblin Mercenary. It's got Start Your Engines. It says other goblins you control have haste. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you make a 1/1 red goblin creature token and it attacks this combat if able. Then max speed, you tap 1 red for each goblin you control. This card's interesting and pretty powerful, I think. It's kind of a missing piece of a goblin deck in standard in particular. To give all your goblins haste is a very powerful effect because of a few different reasons. Well, one, we have Krenko, which is very good to give haste. If you have a bunch of goblins out, say you play a goblin on turn 1, goblin turn 2, play this on turn 3, Krenko, then you have 4 goblins. You can tap it right away to create 4 goblin tokens, and then those also have haste and can attack right away. So there's certainly some interesting synergy combo potential there. You could also play it in sort of Agatha's Soul Cauldron kind of deck with Krenko. I've kind of mentioned that quite a bit throughout these reviews of how that card could be useful in a Goblin deck. It also could maybe be useful in a Start Your Engines sort of deck. We just got this Burnout Bastronaut, which is also a Goblin with Start Your Engines. So maybe there's sort of a sub theme of Start Your Engines in Goblins, and it works particularly well with the Burnout Bastronaut because the max speed ability to add extra mana, this the Bastronaut, funny name, you can sink all that mana into it. So yeah, that's sort of a mana sink, and there's a lot of different goblins in the set that have sort of activated abilities that maybe could be useful to sink your mana into as well. So I think this card is powerful and really fits in nicely with the goblins. And probably if there's going to be a competitive goblin deck, this card would see some play or be a sort of a key piece in that deck. You know, being able to make a goblin every turn is all obviously, of course, powerful, and also fuels its max speed ability. Um, because you're going to have a bunch of goblin tokens in theory if you have this guy out. So definitely a powerful card. Overall, I give Howlsquad Heavy 8 loots out of 10. Okay, next up we've got some commons and uncommons that I think are pretty powerful and might see a play in standard or just play a role in some combo decks or some decks in standard. Um, the first one is the Grim Bauble, which is 1 black mana for an artifact. When it enters, target creature and opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and then 3 to sacrifice it and surveil 2. So mostly using this for the first mode of just an object that comes into play that gives something -2/-2. Now, these sort of self-bounce decks are pretty popular in standard right now. Nurturing pixie decks, this town ain't big enough. There's lots of different effects that let you bounce a permanent back to your hand to reuse them. And I think this card would probably see play either in the main deck or the sideboard of that deck as just an efficient removal spell that you could reuse over and over again against, especially against aggressive decks like the aggressive red decks. This card is quite good against them because it kills almost all their creatures, and giving -2/-2 is pretty powerful and a very efficient mana cost here. It also is just like an artifact that sticks around, so it could just be a removal spell you played on turn 1, and then maybe you're playing a Radiant Lotus combo deck, and then you use it to get 3 extra mana later in the game off the Radiant Lotus. Or you're playing Affinity for artifacts, which is coming back to standard. There's a lot of Affinity cards that we'll see and have seen so far. The Demonic Junker, for example. Just having this in play reduces the cost of all your affinity cards. Also, could be used to kind of fill up your graveyard with its ability to surveil. Always useful to kind of have that on this artifact. It's kind of a bonus. But I think just overall, this is a decently powerful card and has a lot of uses, potential uses in standard. And I'm going to give it 8 loots out of 10. Okay, next up, this is probably one of my favorite cards from the set for sure. 7 mana for this is an uncommon too, which is kind of cool. Usually, I would think this might be a rare, but it says return all mounts and vehicle cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Vehicles you control become artifact creatures until end of turn, and creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So if you have a bunch of vehicles or mounts in your graveyard, brings them all back. They all get haste and they can all attack. So definitely a kind of a game-winning, big, splashy effect here. There's a lot of different things you can kind of do with this. I was thinking of one would just kind of like load up your deck with a bunch of vehicles and then kind of like play Radiant Lotus to sacrifice all your vehicles and then get a bunch of mana. Use the mana to cast, push the limit, and that would return all the vehicles back into play. They all have haste and become creatures and attack for the win. Something like that could be kind of fun. We also have like a cycling vehicles with cycling that are in this set, which are useful for this, just to kind of fill up your graveyard with vehicles. And there's some decent mount creatures as well in the set, like the Guardian Sunmare would be a pretty nice one to return with this and just attack for extra damage with that. And there's some interesting synergy with the Golden Argosy as well, which I guess lets you, if you return all your stuff and you crewed all your things into the Golden Argosy and attack with that, it would blink them all, and they'd come back into play, and then you wouldn't have to sacrifice them at the beginning of your end step. I believe that's how that works. So that could be kind of cute. I'm not sure how good that would be, but it's certainly something you could do with this card as well. Yeah, let me know in the comments below what kind of brews you want to make of this. I think this one's really fun and interesting to think about how to build a deck with. And so I'm looking forward to probably it's going to be a bit janky, but looking forward to building some combos with this thing. Overall, I give it 7 out of 10 loots. Okay, next up we've got the Scrounging Skyray, which is 2 mana for a fish pirate with flying. It says whenever you discard one or more cards, put them any +1/+1 counters on it. It's got cycling for 2, and it's a 1/2. So very similar to the Marauding Mako, but it's blue, costs 2, and has flying, and has another toughness. So um, definitely would probably play both those cards in the same deck, potentially. Um, and you certainly could. So there's sort of this pirate, blue red pirate deck that you could play with these cycling cards and maybe even Grass's Tunnel Grinder. I was thinking it's a very efficient way to discard a bunch of your cards in your hand, um, and sort of pump both of these. So I mean, we can imagine this curve of Mako into the Sky Raid into the Tunnel Grinder, and just like discard 5 or 6 cards. Um, Probably like 5 cards you'd have left in your hand at that point. If you're on the draw, something like that. I haven't done the math, and we give them all like +5/+5 attack. Could be pretty powerful. And yeah, the fact that they all have cycling too, they kind of like work with each other is pretty cool. So yeah, I think this card has some potential. It's pretty powerful. There's other cycling synergy, discard synergy cards in this set too. So I think there's enough to kind of build a deck around this, and I think that if you do, this card is going to be a key piece in it. Um, so overall, I'm going to give it 8 loots out of 10. Okay, next up we've got the Dynamite Diver, which is a 1 mana Goblin pilot, 1/1, and it saddles mounts and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 or greater, and when it dies, it does 1 damage to any target. This card, I think it's not great, but the only reason why I think it's notable is because I would put it in the Spinner of Souls deck that um, I made for Pioneer. Uh, at this point, maybe a few months ago, or a month ago or so, I tried out the Spinner Souls deck that just kind of like sacrifices all its goblins to find another goblin, and just kind of continues to go through the deck that way. So I think this card would fit into that. You kind of want a critical mass of these kind of goblins. So definitely an interesting card. Overall, I don't think it's like super powerful for standard, probably. It's interesting card, and I think there's better 1-drops for goblins. But it's decent and limited. It can saddle you and your mounts and cruiser vehicles, so maybe that would be relevant. I'm not sure if you would play vehicles in a goblin deck or not, but something to kind of keep in mind as well. A lot of kind of text on a 1 mana 1-drop. So um, that is the Dynamite Diver, and also has pretty amazing and sweet art. So that is certainly a boon for this card. And overall, I give it a 6 out of 10 loots because I don't think it's going to see any major constructed play, except maybe in that context of the combo. Okay, next up we've got the Wreckage Wickerfolk, which is a 2 mana scarecrow artifact creature. It's a 1/3 with flying, and when it enters, you surveil 2. So an interesting card. I'm not sure this will see play. I just thought when I saw this, I was like, that's kind of interesting. It does a lot of good stuff. It is an artifact, which can be relevant for like artifact synergies in this set. The one card I thought about was like, oh, maybe this would actually see play in like a Raise the Past sort of deck where you're just trying to fill up your graveyard with a bunch of 2-drops, and this itself is a 2-drop. So it works kind of well with that. It could block creatures potentially. So if it dies, it'll come back with Raise the Past. But maybe it's more of a limited card. I'm not sure. Just something kind of keep in mind as you're kind of like looking for graveyard synergies and things to do. This is pretty efficient at what it does. And Surveil is nice instead of just milling, because you get some selection. Like if there was like a Raise the Past on the top 2 cards of your deck, you could mill the other card and just choose to keep the Raise the Past on top. So yeah, just a card to kind of keep in mind as you're building decks. I think this one is interesting. Overall, I'm going to give it 5 loots out of 10. Okay, these next 2 I kind of am clumping them together because I think they are good for one particular reason. We got the Chitin Gravestalker, which is 6 mana for a 5/4, and it costs 1 less for each artifact and a creature card in your graveyard, cycling for 2, which is cool because there are some kind of cards that do this in standard that like reduce the creatures that reduce their costs for the number of creatures in your graveyard. This also reduces for artifacts in your graveyard, which is something to note. Not sure how relevant that will be, but it also cycles itself, which is good. That's kind of what you want in these decks, because you can kind of get flooded with the enablers versus the cards that benefit from them, and this kind of does both. It kind of will enable multiple other copies of this card by putting itself into the graveyard, but also is a good payoff. And the Memory Guardian is kind of interesting here. We have affinity for artifacts on a 5-mana robot artificer 3/4 with flying. Not a bad rate, actually. I mean, if you're playing this for 1 mana, that's extremely good. Um, and we'll see how good an affinity for artifacts kind of deck is in standard. I think maybe in older formats, like where there's artifact lands legal, um, this could have a much better chance. There is an artifact land, the Clue land, in standard, so maybe there is something there too. But both of these cards, I think, are particularly notable because of Up the Beanstalk, and they cost 5 or more, but you can play them for probably less than 5. Um, and they both work in particular decks, one with artifacts and one with sort of graveyard synergies, but both of them could play maybe Up the Beanstalk, and you're kind of churning through your deck with these kind of cards. So something to kind of keep in mind with, I mean, Up the Beanstalk is a pretty broken card, and the more sort of ways you can kind of enable it or abuse it, the more broken it becomes. So definitely some interesting cards to keep in mind. Overall, I kind of clump them together because they kind of both will serve the same purpose. But I give it 6 out of 10. I don't think they'll see play in like every deck. Obviously, they have to be very specific decks, but I do think they have potential to kind of be powerful in the particular archetypes that they're in. Okay, and last up we've got the Gastal Thrillseeker. This is quite a banger. I think a pretty powerful card. Red and a black lizard berserker, and it has start your engines. And when it enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent, and you gain 1 life. And then max speed is the creature has death touch and haste, and it's a 2/3. So a lot of stats going on here, a lot of things going on here with this card. Just 2 mana, and it starts your engine. And note that when you start your engine, it comes into play. It pings your opponent, so it immediately gets you up to 2 speed. If I'm reading this correctly, I believe that's how it works. You come into play, it starts at 1, and then it pings them, and then it goes up to 2. So even if you didn't have any speed before playing this, it gets you to 2 speed by itself, which is pretty sweet. And then when you get to max speed, having death touch and haste is pretty powerful as well. Gaining life and pinging your opponent is nice for an aggressive deck. So maybe there's like a black red start your engines max speed sort of deck. We've got the gas guzzler. There's a 1 mana goblin that I talked about, which has start your engines. So potentially that's sort of a brew that you could build. It's also a lizard, and its abilities work well with the whole lizard theme of like pinging your opponent. For example, like with in a Gev deck, things like that. A lot of lizard synergies revolve around doing 1 damage to your opponent. So this is exactly what that deck wants, and I think this would slot right into a lizard deck from Bloomburrow. So I think a powerful card. I think it's going to see some play somewhere. I think it's got some good abilities that I would be surprised if it didn't see some play in standard. But overall, I give it an 8 out of 10 loots. So I believe that is it for Aetherdrift. The full set has been revealed. What are you excited about? What sweet combos? I love to hear combo ideas. I always try to brew up interesting ones, but sometimes I get inspiration from other people's uh, janky ideas or whatever it is that you're thinking about for the set. So I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Really appreciate you watching. Thanks so much if you've watched my reviews this spoiler season. What's coming up next is I got some infinite combo and instant win combo videos coming out for the set as well. And then when it drops on Arena, I'm going to, of course, be brewing a bunch of decks and trying them out and see what we can do in standard. So stick to the channel for that, for some gameplay videos with these combos. But yeah, really appreciate you watching. Totally open to feedback on if you like these spoiler videos or not, or anything I can do to improve them. Really hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.